The most dangerous betrayals never begin with a weapon. They begin with a smile across a dinner table. The ballroom overlooking the dark coastline of Busan shimmered like a scene carved out of another world. Crystal chandeliers reflected across polished marble floors, while a live orchestra played softly beneath the sound of expensive laughter and clinking champagne glasses. Nearly 300 guests filled the Grand Aurora Hotel, dressed in black tuxedos, diamond jewelry, and silk gowns worth more than most people made in a year. Politicians stood beside CEOs. Foreign investors whispered beside crime syndicate executives, pretending to be respectable businessmen. And at the center of it all stood Seo Kang-woo. The most feared man in South Korea looked perfectly calm as cameras flashed around him. His tailored black suit fit like armor. His expression barely moved. Even on his wedding night, he looked less like a groom and more like a king attending his own coronation. Beside him stood Han So-yeon, elegant and beautiful beneath layers of white silk and diamonds. She smiled for the cameras with practiced perfection, but her eyes never fully softened when she looked at Kang-woo. Somewhere near the edge of the ballroom stage, Amara Johnson tightened her grip on the violin resting beneath her chin. The soft melody she played floated through the ballroom like smoke, but her attention was no longer on the music. It was on the man standing near the back entrance wearing catering gloves that were one size too large. Amara had noticed him 20 minutes earlier. At first, it was just instinct. The way he avoided eye contact. The way his shoulders stayed too stiff. The way he kept checking the stage instead of serving drinks. She had grown up in Southside Chicago where survival often depended on noticing tiny details before disaster arrived. And now every instinct inside her was screaming. Her fingers slowly stopped moving across the violin strings. The music weakened. Nobody noticed except Kang-woo. His eyes shifted toward her for half a second. Then it happened. The server near the back entrance raised his arm slightly. A small silver object flashed beneath the chandelier lights. Amara's heart nearly stopped. She moved before she could think. High heels struck marble as she rushed through the stunned crowd. Guests turned in confusion as the black violinist suddenly climbed the wedding stage in the middle of the ceremony. Han So-yeon's expression twisted in disbelief. Security guards reached for their earpieces. But Amara never slowed down. She grabbed Kang-woo by the collar and kissed him directly in front of the entire ballroom. Gasps exploded across the room. Camera flashes burst wildly like lightning. Han So-yeon froze completely. The orchestra stopped mid-note. And half a second later, something sharp shot through the air where Kang-woo's head had been moments earlier. A tiny silver dart struck the crystal wall behind them with a faint cracking sound. One chandelier trembled slightly above the silent crowd. Amara pulled away slowly, breathing hard. Kang-woo stared at her without blinking. Close enough to see her eyes shaking. Close enough to realize she was terrified. Around them, the ballroom had become a graveyard of silence. Nobody understood what they had just witnessed. Nobody except the man near the back in trance who quietly disappeared into the crowd the moment the lights reflected off the poisoned dart buried inside the crystal wall. Kang-woo turned his head toward the shattered glass behind him, then back toward Amara. For the first time in years, the most feared man in Seoul looked genuinely shaken. And somewhere deep beneath the music, the diamonds, and the million-dollar smiles, betrayal had finally entered the room. The silence inside the ballroom felt heavier than the ocean outside the glass walls. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The faint sound of rain tapping against the massive windows suddenly became louder than the orchestra that had stopped mid-performance. Seo Kang-woo slowly turned toward the crystal wall behind him, where the silver dart remained buried between shattered lines of glass. One of his security men stepped forward carefully, his face pale as he examined it without touching it. The older guests near the front tables immediately began whispering among themselves. Some looked frightened. Others looked annoyed that the perfect wedding had been interrupted. But most of them were staring at Amara Johnson like she had committed the unforgivable. Han So-yeon recovered first. Her white heels struck the marble floor sharply as she stepped toward Amara, her expression trembling between humiliation and fury. "Who do you think you are?" she demanded, loud enough for the ballroom to hear. "You embarrassed me in front of everyone." Amara stepped back slowly, her breathing uneven. She still held the violin in one hand. "I was trying to protect him," she said quietly. But the words disappeared beneath the rising noise of the crowd. One woman near the VIP tables scoffed openly. "Protect him," she muttered. "She is just looking for attention." Another guest laughed under his breath. These performers always want their moment. The insults spread quickly after that. Crazy woman. Gold digger. The black entertainer lost her mind. Throw her out. Amara lowered her eyes for a moment as the room turned colder around her. She had experienced that look before. The look people gave when they decided your dignity was worth less than theirs. Kong-woo remained completely silent while security surrounded the ballroom. His dark eyes never left Amara's face. Most people mistook his silence for anger. But Kong-woo was not looking at her like a man embarrassed by a scandal. He was studying her, watching the fear in her expression, watching the way her hands still trembled slightly from adrenaline. Because people chasing money did not usually look terrified after getting attention. Then one of the guards approached quickly and whispered something into Kong-woo's ear. The atmosphere shifted instantly. Kong-woo's jaw tightened. "Seal every exit," he said calmly. The room erupted into confusion. Guests began standing from their tables. Several bodyguards moved swiftly toward the rear corridors of the hotel. Han So-yeon stared at him in disbelief. "Kong-woo, what is happening?" He did not answer her immediately. Instead, he walked toward the shattered crystal wall himself. The silver dart reflected beneath the chandelier lights as one of his men carefully held out a small cloth beside it. Even from several feet away, the discoloration on the metal tip was obvious. Whatever had touched that dart was not meant to leave survivors. A nervous silence spread across the ballroom again. Suddenly, the wedding no longer looked glamorous. It looked dangerous. Kong-woo turned slowly toward Amara. "How did you know?" he asked. Every eye in the room shifted toward her. Amara hesitated. "The man near the service entrance," she answered softly. "He kept watching your position instead of the guests." His right sleeve was too stiff, like he was hiding something underneath it. One of the senior guards looked stunned. He had missed it completely. Kong-woo noticed that reaction immediately. His expression darkened slightly. For years, people feared Seo Kong-woo because he noticed weakness faster than anyone else. And tonight, a stranger had seen danger before his entire security team. Han So-yeon folded her arms tightly across her chest. "This is insane," she snapped. "You cannot seriously trust her." Kong-woo finally looked at his fiancée. For the first time that night, there was distance in his eyes. Cold distance. "I trust results," he said quietly. The room went silent again. Rain rolled slowly down the glass walls of the Grand Aurora Hotel, while the wedding guests were escorted into private lounges under heavy security. The music had not returned. Neither had the laughter. Expensive champagne sat untouched across marble tables as whispers spread through every corner of the building. Some guests believed it had been a publicity stunt. Others quietly wondered whether Seo Kong-woo had finally made enough enemies to bring danger into his own wedding. Meanwhile, 2 floors above the ballroom, Amara Johnson sat alone inside a dim security office surrounded by cold blue monitor lights. Her violin rested beside her chair. One security guard stood near the door with his arms crossed, watching her carefully as though she might suddenly become dangerous. Amara kept her hands folded in her lap, trying to slow her breathing. The adrenaline was fading now, leaving behind exhaustion and the uncomfortable realization that she had just kissed one of the most feared men in South Korea in front of half the country's elite families. The door opened quietly. Seo Kong-woo entered without speaking. The room immediately felt smaller. He removed his black suit jacket slowly and placed it across the back of a chair before sitting across from her. His white dress shirt was still perfectly pressed despite the chaos downstairs. Even now, he looked composed. But his eyes were different. Sharper. More alert. Like a man who had suddenly realized the ground beneath him might not be stable anymore. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. The security monitors flickered softly against the walls. Finally, Kong-woo leaned back slightly. "You noticed something that 12 trained men missed," he said calmly. "Explain that to me." Amara looked at him carefully before answering. "Where I grew up, you learned fast, or you did not survive long." Kong-woo remained silent. She continued slowly. "Southside Chicago teaches people to read danger before it happens. Tiny things. Body posture. Eye movement. Nervous hands." The man downstairs looked wrong from the moment he entered the ballroom. Kong-woo studied her expression without blinking. "You recognize the weapon?" Amara nodded once. "Not exactly the weapon. The intention. The answer seemed to interest him more than he expected. Outside the office windows, lightning briefly illuminated the dark ocean beyond Busan's skyline. Kongwu folded his hands together. Most people in that ballroom were more concerned about embarrassment than what almost happened. Amara gave a faint, tired smile. Powerful people usually fear humiliation more than danger. For the first time that night, Kongwu almost smiled back. Almost. Then the expression vanished. "Why save me?" he asked quietly. "You do not know me." Amara lowered her eyes briefly before answering. "Maybe not. But I know what it looks like when someone is about to lose everything in 1 second. Something about her voice changed when she said it. A heaviness. A memory she did not fully explain. Kongwu noticed immediately. He had spent most of his life around liars, politicians, businessmen, and criminals. He knew how fake emotions sounded. But the sadness in Amara's voice was real. One of the security monitors suddenly displayed footage from the ballroom entrance. Kongwu's head turned toward it instantly. The man in catering gloves was gone. Completely vanished from every camera feed after the incident. One of Kongwu's guards entered the office hurriedly. "Sir," he said carefully, "we checked the employment records. Nobody matching that man was hired for tonight." The room became still again. Kongwu slowly looked back toward Amara. This time there was no suspicion in his eyes. Only calculation. Because the moment the fake server disappeared, one terrifying possibility became impossible to ignore. Someone inside the wedding had helped him enter. The storm outside grew heavier after midnight. Rain slid down the towering windows of CO Group Tower, while the city lights of Busan flickered beneath dark clouds like distant fireflies. Most of the wedding guests had already been escorted home under private security, but nobody inside the tower was sleeping. Not anymore. On the 38th floor, Kongwu stood alone inside his private office, staring at the giant digital screen covering one wall. Financial records, hotel surveillance footage, and internal staff files glowed across the dark room, while several members of his security team worked in complete silence behind him. The atmosphere no longer felt like a wedding night. It felt like the beginning of a war nobody had expected. Kongwu loosened the collar of his dress shirt slowly, his eyes fixed on the surveillance timeline from the ballroom. The fake server appeared on camera at exactly 7:42 that evening. But the more disturbing detail came seconds later. One of the hotel security doors had been remotely unlocked from inside the building. Someone with high-level access had cleared the path for him. One of Kongwu's senior analysts swallowed nervously before speaking. "Sir, the access authorization came from a private executive account." Kongwu did not move. "Whose account?" The room hesitated. Even the sound of typing stopped. Finally, the analyst answered carefully. "Miss Han So-yun's wedding management. Credentials." Silence settled across the office like ice. Kongwu slowly looked down at the screen again. His expression barely changed, but something colder entered his eyes. Meanwhile, several floors below, Amara sat quietly near the window of a private guest suite overlooking the rain-soaked harbor. She had been given dry clothes and tea she had barely touched. Her violin case rested near the couch, while 2 guards remained stationed outside her door. Technically, she was not under arrest. But she was not free either. She watched lightning briefly illuminate the ocean and tried to understand how her life had changed so completely in only a few hours. Then the suite door opened. Kongwu entered alone. No bodyguards. No assistants. Just him. Amara immediately stood. The tension between them felt different now. Less hostile. More uncertain. Kongwu walked toward the window without speaking at first. The city lights reflected faintly across his face. "My security team traced the unauthorized access," he finally said quietly. Someone inside the wedding opened the path for the attacker. Amara looked at him carefully. "Your fiancé?" Kongwu did not answer directly. That silence alone was enough. Amara lowered her eyes slightly. "You already suspected her before tonight, did not you?" Kongwu gave a faint, humorless smile. "In my world, trust is temporary." He turned toward her slowly. "But betrayal still has a way of surprising people." For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Rain tapped softly against the glass behind them while the enormous city stretched beneath the storm. Then Kongwu stepped closer and studied her face carefully again. "Most people would have stayed quiet tonight," he said, "especially in a room full of powerful people." Amara looked down briefly before answering. "Power does not scare me as much as guilt." Kongwu stared at her in silence after that. Because for the first time in years, someone had walked into his world without asking him for money, status, or protection. She had only asked that he survive. And somehow, that frightened him more than the betrayal itself. By 2 o'clock in the morning, the storm over Busan had turned the city into a sea of blurred lights and black glass. Inside CO Group Tower, the atmosphere felt colder than the rain outside. Every hallway was lined with security personnel speaking in hushed voices through hidden earpieces while analysts searched through financial records, guest lists, and surveillance footage from the wedding. Nobody trusted anyone anymore. And somewhere in the middle of that tension, Amara Johnson found herself seated at the longest dining table she had ever seen in her life. The private executive dining room stretched nearly 40 feet beneath warm golden lights reflected across polished wood and crystal glasses. Members of CO Kongwu's inner circle sat around the table in expensive suits and tailored dresses, pretending this was still a normal dinner. But the fear underneath their silence was impossible to hide. Kongwu sat at the head of the table, unreadable as always. His expression remained calm, but his eyes moved carefully from person to person, measuring reactions, pauses, and nervous movements the way other men studied business contracts. Amara had been placed near the far end of the table, far away from the executives and family advisors. Nobody had openly objected to her presence, but the message was clear. She did not belong there. One older woman wearing emerald jewelry glanced at Amara before quietly whispering to another guest. Interesting how quickly strangers appear around wealthy men after a scandal. A few people smirked softly into their wine glasses. Another executive adjusted his cufflinks before speaking just loud enough to be heard. Tonight was supposed to be elegant. Instead, we are entertaining musicians. Amara kept her posture straight and her expression calm even as the comments drifted toward her from every side of the room. Years ago, those words would have embarrassed her. But life had already taught her that dignity was not something other people could hand you. It was something you protected quietly for yourself. Across the table, Kongwu noticed every comment. He said nothing, but his eyes darkened slightly each time someone spoke. Dinner continued beneath the sound of rain against the windows. Plates were replaced. Wine was poured. Nobody touched the subject everyone feared most. Betrayal. Then suddenly the lights went out. The entire room dropped into darkness. Several guests gasped immediately. One woman nearly knocked over her chair. Emergency backup lights failed to activate for several seconds, leaving only the faint glow of lightning outside the windows. And in that darkness, Amara heard it. A soft metallic click near Kongwu's side of the table. Her head snapped toward the sound instantly. "Do not drink that," she said sharply. The room froze. A second later, the emergency lights flickered back on. Every eye turned toward Kongwu, just as his hand hovered inches away from a crystal wine glass. One of the servers standing nearby suddenly looked pale. Too pale. Kongwu slowly lowered his hand without breaking eye contact with the trembling employee. The room became deathly quiet. Nobody moved. Nobody even reached for their phones. Kongwu stood up carefully, his voice calm enough to terrify everyone listening. "Check every bottle served tonight." The server near him swallowed hard. Amara noticed the sweat forming along the man's forehead. Kongwu noticed it too. And for the second time in one night, the woman everyone mocked had seen danger before anyone else in the room. The silence that followed felt heavier than fear itself. The investigation inside CO Group Tower continued until nearly dawn. Security teams moved through hallways carrying tablets and confidential files while lawyers, analysts, and senior executives were questioned one by one behind closed doors. Nobody trusted the calm anymore. Not after 2 separate attempts against CO Kongwu in the same night. Yet strangely, the only place inside the entire building that felt peaceful was the rooftop garden above the executive floors. The rain had finally softened into a light mist drifting across the city skyline, while Seoul-style lantern lights glowed faintly beside rows of dark green bamboo. Around 4 in the morning, Amara stood alone beneath the covered terrace with her violin resting against her shoulder. She had not planned to play, but silence sometimes became too heavy to carry without music. The first notes rose softly into the cold air, slow and aching beneath the distant sound of traffic far below the tower. It was not performance music anymore. There were no wealthy guests. No applause. Just emotion poured quietly into the dark. She closed her eyes while she played, unaware that someone had entered the rooftop behind her. Seo Kongwoo stopped several feet away and listened without interrupting. For a man surrounded by noise his entire life, the quiet honesty of the melody felt unfamiliar, almost dangerous. Amara eventually lowered the violin and noticed him standing there. For a second, neither of them spoke. Kongwoo looked different without the ballroom lights and expensive crowd surrounding him. Tired. Human. The sharp perfection he carried in public had faded slightly beneath the long night. "You play like someone remembering something painful," he said quietly. Amara gave a faint smile. "Sometimes music says things people cannot." Kongwoo walked slowly toward the edge of the rooftop overlooking the sleeping city. "My mother played piano," he said after a long silence. The admission surprised even him. He rarely spoke about family. "She used to practice late at night after my father disappeared into meetings." His eyes remained fixed on the skyline. "When I was 11 years old, one of his closest friends betrayed him for money." Amara listened quietly. "After that, my father trusted nobody. Eventually my mother stopped smiling too." A cold breeze moved through the rooftop garden. Kongwoo folded his hands behind his back. "People think power protects you," he continued softly. "But power only teaches you how alone you really are." Amara looked at him carefully then. Not like a mafia boss. Not like a billionaire feared across the country. Just a man exhausted from carrying armor for too many years. "Lonely people usually become experts at pretending they do not need anyone," she said gently. Kongwoo looked at her for a long moment after that. Most people around him spoke with caution, fear, or hidden ambition. But Amara spoke to him like none of those things mattered. No flattery, no manipulation, just honesty. It unsettled him more than threats ever could. A faint vibration interrupted the silence. Kongwoo glanced down at the encrypted phone in his hand. His expression hardened immediately. The warmth disappeared from his eyes almost instantly. Amara noticed the change. "What happened?" she asked quietly. Kongwoo stared at the message for several seconds before answering. "One of my financial directors just disappeared." The rooftop suddenly felt colder again. Kongwoo slowly lifted his eyes toward the dark skyline of the city. Somewhere beneath those millions of lights, someone was still moving pieces against him. And for the first time in years, he realized the enemy might already be sitting inside his empire. Morning arrived gray and heavy over Busan, but inside CO Group Tower the lights never turned off. Entire departments had been locked down overnight while Kongwoo's internal investigators moved through offices collecting encrypted drives, financial statements, and private communications. Executives who once walked confidently through the building now avoided eye contact with security guards. Fear had changed the atmosphere completely. Somewhere inside the empire, someone had tried to erase Seo Kongwoo from the board, and now everyone was wondering who would fall first. Amara stood near the windows of the executive lounge holding a cup of untouched coffee while analysts worked behind her. She had barely slept. Every few minutes, another whispered conversation drifted through the room. Missing records, deleted accounts, secret transfers routed through overseas companies. The deeper the investigation went, the uglier the picture became. Then one sentence suddenly cut through the silence behind her. "Sir, we found payments linked to Director Choi." Amara slowly turned. Across the room, Kongwoo stared at the large digital screen displaying financial records connected to Choi Min-suk, the man who had served as his closest advisor for nearly 12 years. Several offshore transfers appeared beside encrypted communication logs dating back almost 8 months. Kongwoo's face did not move, but the room itself seemed to grow colder around him. Choi Min-suk was not just another executive. He was the man who knew every weakness inside CO Group. The man Kongwoo trusted with security access, private schedules, and internal operations. "How long has he been missing?" Kongwoo asked quietly. "Since 11:30 last night," one analyst answered nervously. His phone was turned off 40 minutes after the wedding incident. Kongwoo remained silent for several seconds. Then another file appeared on the screen. This one hit harder. Hidden communication records between Choi Min-suk and Han So-yeon. Private meetings. Financial promises. International account transfers. Amara watched the colors slowly disappear from several executives' faces around the room. The wedding had never been about love. It had been a business takeover disguised as a marriage. Kongwoo finally stepped closer to the screen, his eyes fixed on the evidence with terrifying calm. Everything was planned, he said softly. The wedding, the merger, the attacks. One of the security officers swallowed hard. Sir, there is more. He pressed another file open. A building surveillance image appeared from less than an hour earlier. Amara froze instantly. The image showed two men escorting a woman through an underground parking structure. The camera angle was blurry, but the face was unmistakable. Her own. The timestamp was impossible because she had been inside the tower all morning. Kong Wu turned sharply toward her. Where were you at 7:20? Here. Amara answered immediately. I never left this floor. Another image appeared beside the first one. This time it showed someone wearing a dark coat and carrying a violin case identical to hers entering a black sedan outside the tower garage. The room exploded into whispers. Someone was using her identity. Someone wanted her connected to the conspiracy. Kong Wu stared at the screen for a long moment before slowly looking back at Amara. The fear in her eyes was real. Too real to fake. Then his encrypted phone vibrated again. A new message appeared on the screen. One sentence only. If you want the truth, come alone. Beneath the message was an address on the outskirts of Busan, and attached to it was a recent photograph of Amara walking through the underground parking garage less than 5 minutes earlier. The address from the anonymous message led to an abandoned shipping terminal near the outer docks of Busan, where thick fog rolled in from the ocean and swallowed entire rows of silent cargo containers. By the time CO Kongwu arrived, dawn had barely begun coloring the horizon. Gray light reflected across wet pavement, while distant ship horns echoed through the harbor like warnings carried through the mist. He stepped out of the black sedan alone despite every objection from his security team. The message had been clear. Come alone or lose the truth forever. Kongwu walked slowly through the empty terminal, his dark coat moving with the cold wind coming off the water. The place smelled like rain, steel, and old secrets. Somewhere nearby, a loose chain clinked softly against metal in the wind. Then he saw her. Amara stood beneath one of the overhead loading cranes near the edge of the dock, wrapped in a dark coat with her violin case resting beside her feet. Relief flashed across Kongwu's face so quickly most people would have missed it. But the moment he stepped closer, he realized something was wrong. Amara looked shaken, not frightened for herself, frightened for him. You should not have come alone, she said quietly. Kongwu stopped several feet away. You sent the message? Amara immediately shook her head. No. The answer landed heavily between them. Before Kongwu could speak again, footsteps echoed from the far side of the terminal. Several figures emerged slowly from the fog, wearing dark coats and business suits instead of masks or weapons. At the center stood Choi Min-suk. Kongwu's former advisor looked exhausted beneath the pale morning light, but there was no fear left in his face anymore. Only resignation. You always were stubborn, Choi said softly. Kongwu stared at him without emotion. You betrayed me. Choi lowered his eyes briefly. No, he answered quietly. I betrayed the empire you became. The fog drifted heavily around the shipping terminal while silence stretched between them. Then another figure stepped forward from behind Choi. Han So-yeon. Her white wedding elegance was gone now, replaced by a dark tailored coat and cold, unreadable eyes. She looked nothing like the smiling bride from the ballroom. This was never personal, she said calmly. CO Group controls too much money, too much influence, too much fear. People wanted change. Kongwu almost smiled at that, but there was no warmth in it. So you decided to erase me. So-yeon did not answer. She did not need to. Kongwu slowly looked around the terminal, then back toward Choi. You brought her here to frame her, he said quietly, finally understanding everything. The surveillance photos. The fake movements. You wanted me to believe she was part of this. Choi remained silent. That silence confirmed it. Amara looked at Kongwu with disbelief in her eyes. They knew you would trust evidence more than people, she whispered. Kongwu stared at her for a long moment after that. Then something shifted inside him. For years he had built his empire by trusting numbers, contracts, leverage, and fear. But the only honest person he had met in this entire nightmare was the woman everyone in that ballroom mocked. The realization settled into the cold morning air with terrifying clarity. Kongwu slowly turned back toward the people who had betrayed him. No anger crossed his face. No shouting. Just disappointment, so deep it felt colder than the ocean behind them. And somehow, That silence frightened them more than rage ever could. 3 days later, the entire country watched CO Group's emergency executive meeting unfold through leaked headlines and financial reports. News stations spoke carefully, never fully saying the word mafia out loud, but everyone understood what had happened behind the polished walls of the empire. Internal corruption, secret offshore transfers, executives removed overnight, contracts frozen, political allies suddenly distancing themselves from Han So-yun and Choi Min-suk as if they had never known them at all. Yet inside the main executive conference room of CO Group Tower, there were no screaming arguments and no dramatic confrontations. Only silence. CO Kong-woo stood at the head of the long marble table while enormous digital screens displayed financial records, security footage, private communications, and signed agreements connected to the conspiracy. One by one, every lie collapsed beneath cold evidence. Nobody defended themselves anymore. Nobody raised their voice. Several executives simply stared at the table in front of them as years of ambition quietly dissolved in a single morning. Han So-yun sat near the far end of the room wearing a cream-colored suit instead of a wedding dress now. She looked exhausted for the first time since Kong-woo had met her. Choi Min-suk remained beside her, older somehow, like guilt itself had finally become too heavy to carry. Kong-woo never insulted them, never threatened them. He only looked at them with the disappointment of a man who had finally learned how expensive trust could become. "You built your future on betrayal," he said calmly. "Now you will live with the ruins." Nobody answered. Outside the towering windows, rain drifted slowly across the skyline of Busan, while the room remained frozen beneath the weight of quiet justice. By evening, the engagement was officially canceled. Several executives resigned before midnight. Others disappeared from public life completely. And somewhere beneath all the financial headlines and political damage control, one truth remained impossible to ignore. The only person who had tried to save Seo Kong-woo without asking for power or money had been the woman nobody respected when she first entered the ballroom. The next morning, Incheon International Airport buzzed with the noise of rolling suitcases, boarding calls, and travelers rushing beneath bright terminal lights. Amara Johnson stood near gate 214, holding her boarding pass and violin case, while planes moved slowly across the rain-covered runway outside the massive windows. She had refused the penthouse, refused the money, refused every luxury Kong-woo quietly offered after the investigation ended. Some people survive darkness by becoming part of it. Amara never wanted that life. Her flight to Chicago would begin boarding in 20 minutes. She looked out at the gray sky and told herself leaving was the right decision. Then footsteps stopped behind her. She turned slowly. Seo Kong-woo stood there alone in a dark coat with no bodyguards, no assistants, and no empire surrounding him. Just a tired man who looked like he had not slept in days. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. The noise of the airport faded strangely around them. Kong-woo finally stepped closer, his voice quieter than she had ever heard it before. "My entire life," he said slowly. "People looked at me and saw fear, money, or power." His eyes held her steadily. "You were the first person who looked at me and saw a human being." Amara felt her throat tighten slightly. Kong-woo lowered his eyes for a moment before continuing. "You saved my life twice. Once from them." He looked back at her softly. "And once from becoming someone even I could no longer recognize." The boarding announcement echoed gently through the terminal. Amara smiled sadly through watery eyes and adjusted the strap of her violin case. Kong-woo stepped aside without trying to stop her. Because real respect does not chain people down. It lets them choose freely. Amara walked slowly toward the boarding gate before pausing one final time to look back at him. The feared man who once controlled entire rooms with silence now stood alone beneath the airport lights, quieter than anyone around him. And that day, beneath the sound of departing planes and falling rain, Seo Kong-woo finally learned what dignity truly looked like.